so far. That's been a good experience. Maybe I missed one, but generally speaking, I'm trying to be here. So, what I'm presenting now is, as most things that we start today, some early stage research in a way. And because of that, of course, I would be happy to receive as much feedback as possible. And that also means please interrupt me at any time. Those of you who know me know that I almost always start with a little presentation of Liechtenstein. And there's a reason for that. I mean, we all come from nice and interesting countries, but Liechtenstein is very particular. And I think Helen is the only one who's been there, particularly in a sense because it's very small. It's a principality. I don't know if there's any other principalities in the world. So we have an actual prince in a castle, that is a castle. And he lives there. And if the flag is out, the prince is there, the prince is in. And if the flag is not there, the prince is not there. He's Austrian actually, and he spends a lot of time in Austria. So not there. Right there, but it's him. So the prince is there. I mean, it's a rather big castle, and it's open once a year actually. So it's very tough to actually see it. And we have some lakes and a lot of mountains, and this is what it looks like during wintertime. This year we have a lot of snow, a couple of meters, like 3-4 meters, depending on where you went. Some spots even 5 meters. Anyway, so when you get the chance to visit, these are the things that you will see. And this is a country. And actually on that map you see each and every, let's say, visit place. The biggest place is called Shan, and it's about 9,000 inhabitants, but it's not the capital. The capital is Vaduz. So this is what I learned when she visited. And it's in between Switzerland and Austria. It covers an area of about 140 square kilometers, and it's approximately 20 kilometers from north to south and 7 from east to west, depending on where you look at it. So it's a rather small but very nice place. And we have a university, the University of Liechtenstein, and we're committed to sustainability. That's what it says on our website. And that means that we actually do have funding to do research. And I found it interesting that you just said, like, your students look into making UCT more environmentally sustainable. We have an actual research project that is intended to transform the university into a sustainable entity. We have about 1,200 people there, like 1,000 students, 200 employees, something like that. So it's rather small, which I guess comes along with a couple of advantages when it comes to transforming the organization. So we can actually do things, change things, and we see the actual effects of what we do. It has nothing to do with the research that I'm presenting, except for that it is about sustainability. And I'll go through the next slides real quick, because this is all stuff that we know. We know that technology has what we can call a dual role. It is not sustainable per se. Anything that is produced consumes resources. Computers consume resources and simulate wastage and emission throughout their life cycle. But what we also know is that there can be a solution to a problem. And if you look at things like wind and solar energy, for example, that is obviously a potential solution for a whole bunch of problems, but there are also unwanted negative consequences. For example, through producing those facilities, but also through changing the landscape. And this certainly also holds true for information technology, and this is because there's two different things we're looking at. And today we have the notion green IT and IT for green. So by green IS, we essentially mean IT for green. And the major difference, let's illustrate that real quick, is green IT is about making technology, information technology, more sustainable, related to its more physical existence throughout the life cycle. Whereas, so making data centers more energy efficient, for example, whereas green IS is about leveraging information systems in order to design and implement green processes. And this is why I mentioned this, even though I know everybody knows it's here, because we're talking about green IS now, and we're asking two questions. But before I come to that, I just mentioned that I was here for the other workshops as well. And the very first green workshop was as ISIS in St. Louis. I presented a little paper and we're talking about green business process management, and essentially what we said as well, any sort of information technology doesn't produce greenness, sustainability, but through process change, organizations become more environmentally sustainable. So we leverage technologies, the affordances provided by technologies in order to create sustainable businesses. Well, this is what I presented last time. It's a bit vague in a way. And today I would like to talk about two research questions. The first one is, what is an environmentally sustainable business process anyways? So can we become more specific instead of saying that, well, this doesn't do any harm to the environment? And then, how do, and I'll get to why we ask this question in a few seconds, how do functional affordances of information systems contribute to both incremental and radical process change in order to create more sustainable business processes? So we're trying to understand how can we leverage information systems in order to create more sustainable processes. So let's start. Let's look at the first question. And we base our understanding and definition of what constitutes a sustainable business process on a definition provided by a person named Goodland in 1995, and that's actually cited a lot in management. And what he essentially does is he says there are two major environmental functions: the source function, the resources that we consume, and the sink function, related to the emissions and waste that are assimilated. And then there are also change principles. And we use this definition, that's our first theoretical basis if you want so, in order to define what is an environmentally sustainable process. So first there's an output rule, and what you can see on the left hand side, this is what Goodland says about environmental sustainability, about the output rule. Waste emissions from a project or action being considered should be kept within the assimilative capacity of the local environment without unacceptable degradation of its future waste absorptive capacity or other important services, as for example producing new resources. That's the output. And then we can relate it to business processes. For example, we say that the extent of emissions that originate from a specific business process, which can be kept within the assimilated capacity of the environment within which it is executed, should be maximized, and at the same time the consumption of those things that exceed the absorptive capacity should be minimized. The same works with the input rule. Goodland distinguishes renewables and non-renewables as in resources, and we can also translate that into business processes. So the extent of renewable inputs of a business process which are harvested within the generative capacities of the natural environment should be maximized. So simple story. And then finally we have the change principles by Goodland, and also that we could transfer to business processes. For example, we are interested in the fact that processes need to be optimized with regard to their environmental efficiency as opposed to their throughputs. Increased levels of environmental efficiency lower both inputs and outputs of a given process, and so forth. These are certainly things that we can discuss and that need to be discussed. And this is what I'm showing that. And there's also a paper online. And so if I can receive any feedback also related to how we word that, how we phrase that, that would be very valuable. So, that much about the definition of what is a sustainable process, and now we're asking the more interesting question from an information systems perspective: how can information systems be leveraged in order to make those processes that have a source function and that have a sink function and that have some transformation in between more environmentally sustainable? And what we use is another theoretical lens here, actually the first theoretical lens in the sense that we use, and that is functional affordances, and maybe this is why I can talk about functional affordances. Good morning. So, what is a functional? So this is what we're looking at. So we have a source function, a missing error, a transformation, and a sink function essentially. And the question is, well, what is the role of information systems in this context? So information systems, so that is the assumption, can reduce the use of renewable and non-renewable resources through different things that we can do. On the sink side, IS can enable processes that assimilate less pollution and waste. And as to the transformation, where things actually happen, information systems enable processes, so that is the assumption, that use less renewable and non-renewable resources, and thereby, of course, impacting both the source and the sink function of a specific business process. In order to provide an answer to that question, so how can IS be used in order to make those processes more environmentally sustainable, we leverage this concept of affordances. Affordances are based on the idea that any technology comes along with potential uses that we can make from that technology. So that is opposed to a deterministic understanding of technologies where we expect that a certain technology leads to certain consequences. And it actually originates from a discipline called ecological psychology, a person called Gibbons. And he said, well, what actually happens is that at the interface between individuals and technologies, action possibilities that the affordances emerge that then in turn need to be realized or actualized and acted, if you want so. So it's about potential uses, and this is why I like a lot of the things that I heard this morning about Twitter and so forth, because what we actually see is we have some technologies there, and we don't really know what it does and what it can do, but it affords things, and it's about understanding and interpreting what technology can actually do and finding ways of using that. And we could talk an hour about interesting developments that we see now when it comes to different things. This and that. This is opposed to properties of information technology, so material properties, built-in things, often also referred as capabilities. So the idea here is that those properties are just one part of the affordance because it only for a certain group offers action possibilities. So affordances relate to the behaviors that are permitted through the properties of an object. And here's my example. That's some sort of technology taken, not necessarily information technology. And this technology affords different things depending on who you are and what you do. A cat sits on a table, jumps onto the table, walks underneath the table, different things. Whereas a person would sit at the table, eat from the table, and so forth. So the same technology offers different things to different people, and very obviously the same also holds true for computers and software and packages, social media, and so forth. So that's the general idea. And this is the conceptual model we propose based on that. So what essentially happens is that, of course, we do have information systems that come along with some certain properties, but how those properties can be leveraged, can be used, what effects they can actually have, depends on the context. And we look at the process level now. And every process is carried out in a certain process, meaning in an organization by a group of people with different skills and so forth. And the question now is, what functional affordances do information systems provide to that specific process in a specific context? So that relates back to the idea that affordances are a relation between the individual, the context, and of course the material properties of IT. And then the question is, how do those affordances or the actualization of those affordances impact on sync function, source function, of course the transformation that happens throughout the process. So that is the general idea. And based on that, we came up with some very early conjectures. One is saying material properties of information systems can provide functional affordances that involve incremental or radical changes towards more environmental sustainability if interpreted in the light of specific business processes or a class of business processes. Sorry for reading that out. And we have a couple of more. So the second one relates to the transformation process, and then we have one relating to the source function and one relating to the sync function. So one is more general, and the other ones relate to the three areas. So that is the general idea. And now the question, of course, is how can we continue working with that? Here's one illustrative example. What we would refer to as radical change of the sales process. So, for example, someone has to meet customers overseas, fly there all the time. A couple of years back, they had to do that because information technology was not yet good enough, so to speak, to actually replace a lot of meetings. Now, when you saw the picture that I showed you, there's tools like Cisco Telepresence. And it works like that. So you sit in a room, and there's different rooms all over the world, and every room looks the same. So you really perceive it as being in the same room, face to face. And this is a very powerful tool of actually virtually communicating, and that can actually replace, for example, physical travel. And in fact, it does reduce physical travel a lot. And also, of course, that has an impact on the source function of the according process, it has an impact on the sync function, and also on the transformation, because the process looks totally different. Not just flying somewhere in order to sell something, as opposed to going there physically is a major difference. Of course, what I didn't really discuss now is that anything that happens here always has also negative impacts. Running any type of information technology costs a lot of energy. And I just got my iPad there, and I could probably print out many more pages than I would in order to make up for the damage, the environmental damages caused by producing that iPad, and then also in terms of the waste that it's going to constitute eventually in 2 or 3 years when there's an iPad 4 or 5, whatever. So that's also happening. But I think we can see that information systems very obviously have impacts on sourcing, function, also transformation. And we could continue this with other examples. So, in conclusion, functional forensics of information systems, that is the assumption impact on sourcing, functional business processes. They can lead both to incremental and radical changes. The sales process example that was radical, but a more incremental change would, for example, be related to printing duplex instead of single-page printing and so forth, like anything that makes minor changes but does not replace the entire process. And I think there are now quite a few very interesting questions, and they also relate to the things that we've been discussing all morning. What functional forensics are there? We have so many technologies, and we don't really yet know what they're good for. And this is why we get surprised all the time because things happen that we did not expect them to happen, like what happened in the Mid-East and those changes. So I think we need to better understand what is it that IT actually does and how it can actually be used and appropriated in different situations. And in terms of future research, well, I mean, there's so many things one can do now. You can certainly do exploratory case studies in order to, and this is what a few people here in the room intend to do, obviously, in order to understand what is it about technology that matters. But also thinking of our model, for example, it would be interesting to do some quantitative research, which very often comes along with a big challenge because affordances as a relation needs to be operationalized and then tested. So this is certainly not an easy task. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm happy to answer questions and to receive feedback.
Well, I've got one very important question. That system that Cisco has, can we get for our SIGREEN meetings? Anyone know?
I guess it's you can buy that. It's probably one of the most expensive out there. But what I should do is should go on YouTube and watch some videos that show how that tool actually works.
We can imagine how it works.
Yeah, they have also like screens as big as people are in different things. So it's really
it's the business and social side of it that we'd like to get right. The technology's fine.
Yeah. I have actually a point. The paper that you referenced, Marcus and Silver, was that the paper that was an extension of ASC's active structuration theory?
Yes, that's what's about.
So I think that kind of approach really expects an affordance to be unpredictable. I think you're kind of looking at it as something we could find out ahead of time. So that line of research, and also this the first person that you mentioned, Gilbert or Gibbons. Yes. He also his perception of it is really that it's really this unpredictable. Yeah. So it's kind of like a bottom up type of thing. So it's if you look at it more as like, let's discover it, or let's just see how it works, as they say, in the wild. You may be able to capture more, rather than.
I think you can actually grasp from two questions, from two angles. As you just said, bottom up, you see what comes out, what works in a way. But also, if I have a certain business problem or environmental problem, situation, and I need to find a solution, I could either ask, well, what are the specific features that I need, or I could ask, well, what are the actions that I need people to do? And then I talk about affordances. And then I try to identify, well, what technologies could I use or do I have to design? So I think you could also come that way.
Right.
And I think it's just a very appropriate way to think about what information technology actually does. And through the developments that we've seen over the last years, it becomes very obvious that this deterministic view that we used to apply a lot doesn't really work for many situations. And there's a few factors that come in here when it comes to environmental sustainability, like intrinsic motivational factors, for example, that also matter, because this is an important factor that makes people appropriating IT in totally new ways that they haven't thought about earlier. Because there's so many technologies out there that we can use to do stuff that's more environmentally sustainable. And Twitter wasn't made to study. To change the world in that way. It was a byproduct, as we just discussed. So I think it's both sides.
Just on point of affordance, I'm quite intrigued because there are different definitions. You refer to Gibbons, you probably know Gibbons talks of affordance as a gestalt, as something that we have globally. We will now call it a systemic, a global thing, before you look at the detail. So it's very much a conceptually top-down. I see something that attracts me, but I don't really know why. And that's quite intriguing to look at. It's a revisiting of the Gestalt psychology, and that implies that something intrigues you, attracts you, it's an attractor, and then that it attracts you to the tool. In fact, and that's something. So in other words, it's the invisible that creates a visible foreground, background.
Exactly.
And in design design of what we see, it's important that we take that into account. It's not a structural feature; it's around the structural feature that creates the gestalt. I don't know the term in English, or the general feeling of wanting to go further. So in that sense, affordance is very rich. If we take from Gibbons' point of view, and not a more recent and a strictly user-determinist approach, which is in fact detracking what Gibbons wanted in the first place.
Yeah,
I don't know how you feel about that.
I think we're actually moving back to the original understanding. So what Marcus and Silva do, that is very closely related to what Gibbons actually does. But in HCI, in human-computer interaction, you had a different interpretation because affordances became kind of built in. So I built an affordance into a technology, but that's not what we're saying. This is why I struggle with the formulation sometimes, because we say affordance originated in information systems, which for me makes some sense because an information system is a social technical system. So you have the different components in there. But what I fully agree with what you said, and I think what's happening here is that people start reframing in a way and also reinterpreting technology because of new action goals. So I now know I want to be more environmentally sustainable for different reasons, be it regulated, be it normative, be it whatever. And based on that, I start looking at the technologies that are there again. And based on that, the actual affordance emerges, and then it also needs to be realized. It's always a two-step process. And that depends on different factors, on environmental factors, but also of technology, of course. And this is why it's important that we have better technology today, I guess.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.